The wind carried a sound I almost didn't hear, soft and cracked, and so alone it cut right through the heat. Help. That's how trouble started for me. Not with a gunshot or a poker debt, but with a voice a man could pretend was the breeze if he wanted a quiet life. And yeah, I could have kept writing, but I didn't, because once you hear someone ask for help out loud, you can't unhear it. You know what I mean. I pulled Jasper up on the ridge and let the reins hang while the planes went still the way they do before a storm that isn't about the weather. Let me back up a sec. Because I'm not a hero, I'm a cattle hand with a decent piece of land north of AO. And on that late afternoon in New Mexico, the sun was laying itself across the grass like a sheet of hammered brass, and every cottonwood leaf had a shine on it. And that's when I saw her in the cut by the creek bed. Dusty dress, sleeve torn where the willow snagged it, hands braced at her ribs like she was holding herself together with will alone. I called out soft and came down slow, boots on sand, hands open where she could see them, and when she flinched at my shadow, it wasn't the jump of a spooked rabbit. It was the reflex of someone who's learned to meet pain a half-second before it lands. Up close I could hear the scrape in her breathing, could see the dry white cracks in her lips. But it was the mark that stopped me. Round, purple-red, deep like it had fingers inside it. Not something the land gives you. Something a man gives you when he wants you to wear his meanness on your skin. She kept her eyes on the ground, like she was measuring the distance to run. Name's Caleb, I said, voice low. Because sometimes men don't do the world any favors raising their voices. You hurt bad. She said, Lila, on a whisper that broke in the middle, and she said, don't take me back. And I said, you're not going anywhere you don't wanna, not while you're standing on my dirt. And that was that. I put her on Jasper and walked him home on the long slope where the light tilts. One hand steady on her ankle to keep her from sliding, and every few steps she'd look over her shoulder at the open country like the horizon had teeth. My cabin's plain, log walls. A stone hearth that pulls smoke straight, shelves lined with jars I fill every August when the peaches are thick. Nothing a man brags on. But it's mine, it's clean, and it's safe when I say so. I set a cup of water in her hands and watched her drain it like she'd been saving thirst for a week. Then I waited out her silence because you can't rush a voice that's been punished. When she said, you don't know them, I said, you don't know me. And that was true too. Folks think quiet men are harmless until they learn we use quiet to hear footsteps. I didn't sleep that first night. The lamp burned low in the kitchen, and I sat by the table with my rifle laid across it the way a man puts a hand on a dog's neck, friendly, but ready. Wind moved through the grass outside. And every time it hissed, I saw shapes in my head, riders on the ridge, mean men with time to waste. Morning made the room honest again, and in that light Lila looked younger and older both. The kind of tired that settles in the bones. They brand you with fear, she said without me asking, and she touched the bruise with 2 fingers, careful as a prayer. They don't use iron. They use hands, and you carry it either way. I made coffee, told her to eat, and when she shook her head I said, eat anyway, and she did. And a piece of color came up in her cheeks that hadn't been there. 2 days went, and then trouble showed itself the way it always does, straight-backed and sure from the ridge. One rider first. Black hat low, good horse throwing dust like it had an opinion. I stepped onto the porch and leaned near the rifle without touching it, because some men read hands better than faces. Looking for a girl, he said, easy as a store clerk. Slim, pale hair. She came this way. I kept my face loose. Haven't seen her. He smiled without his eyes and said, she don't belong to you. And I said, she doesn't belong to anyone. And the way his jaw worked told me the conversation had ended even though words were still coming out. You don't understand, he said. She owes folks. And I said, you should ride on before you find out what I owe. And we let the air stretch thin between us until he clicked his tongue and turned south. Yeah, that happened. And the second he was out of sight, I knew he'd be back with friends who didn't mind leaving marks. That evening I told Lila plain, they'd return, and I'd be ready. And if she wanted to ride east under a moon, I'd saddle Jasper twice. She stared into the fire until her eyes carried flame and said, you don't have to do this. And I said, maybe I do. Because I remembered other nights and other voices I'd called wind to keep my sleep, and I wasn't going to be that man again. Next day, I moved sacks of beans and flour into the main room, set the table against the front door, hammered an extra crossbar inside the back, and laid cartridges in a row where my hand fell without looking. Lila fed the chickens like she was learning a song, smiled once at a hen that pecked her boot, then went quiet again when a hawk's shadow crossed the yard. Fear isn't a thing you chase out. It's a tenant who pays late. They came by moonlight. 3 shapes on the slope where the sagebrush turns black. They called out first with voices like varnish, offered to take what's theirs and leave me in peace. Promised I wouldn't be troubled again, and when I didn't move they got careful in that way mean men do right before they break something. I thumbed the rifle back just enough so they could hear the metal talk. "One more step," I said, "and you won't take another." And there must have been something true under the words because their boots didn't find the porch. That should be the end of it in a good world, but we don't live in a good world all the way through. And the twist in this tale is that the boy who eased his horse forward next, hat pushed back like he was just stopping by for sugar, was Eli, 18 at most. Summer help I'd hired the last 2 seasons to mend fence and talk too loud about girls he'd never meet. Eli looked at me and then at the men beside him, and I could see the math he was doing. Money promised, fear enforced, the memory of his little sister who'd fallen out of a cottonwood, and how I'd wrapped her arm and sent them home with peaches. He kept his voice small. "Caleb," he said, "they ain't leaving." And then he did the smallest brave thing I've ever seen. He nudged his horse 3 steps sideways and broke the line just enough so the men weren't shoulder to shoulder anymore. And in that sliver of space the night felt less inevitable. The one in the black hat cursed him under his breath and reached for his boot gun. And I snapped a shot high, took the lantern glass hanging from their saddle horn and blew it across the slope in sparks. Dark, and I heard hooves scramble and a man spit out a word he meant to keep in. We held through the dark hours like that, trading silence and the occasional threat the way poker players trade bluffs. Just before dawn, with the sky a strip of tin over the eastern hills, Lila touched my sleeve and said, "I need to show you something." And we slipped out the back to the lean-to where I keep tack oiled in coils of rope hung neat. She pulled a small wrapped bundle down from the rafter above the door. "I took this," she said, "from them. And when I unwrapped it, I found a ledger bound in cheap leather, pages full of names and numbers, and a map sketched rough of trails and holding places, debts recorded in bodies. The kind of book men keep when they want to own people without admitting it out loud." "You bring this here?" I asked, because that changed the weight of everything. She nodded once, chin up like she was ready to take the hit for it. "They hurt me because I said no," she whispered. "So I took the part of them that hurts most. It wasn't just hiding anymore, it was witness. And witness calls men to choose." "All right," I said. "Then we send this where it can't be buried." And that morning, while 3 riders tried to look like a small army, I wrote a letter with the ledger wrapped inside, sealed it into a sack stamped for Santa Fe, and sent Eli, on Jasper to meet the stage at the ford with instructions to hand it to the driver in front of God and anyone watching. "You sure?" he asked, and I said, "Be more sure of this than anything you've done," and he rode like he meant it. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, the men out front had grown impatient, which is another word for careless. Black Hat eased forward, 2 fingers resting on his thigh where a pistol waited to be fast, and I saw the shape of the day if I let him. The thing about standing your ground is you have to mean it so completely you teach the other man what will happen to him if he makes you prove it. I stepped off the porch into the light so he could see my face, and I talked low enough that he had to lean to hear. And I told him about the ledger riding east and the names inside it, and the map that tied what he did in the dark to men with offices and rings on their fingers. "You follow that, boy," I said, "and every town between here and Santa Fe will know why you're riding." And I watched the arithmetic happen behind his eyes, the kind of trouble he could handle and the kind he couldn't. Folks who'd come because the night said something was happening. Doc Harlan with his satchel and the limp he got in a Tennessee field. Senora Ortega from the smithy with a hammer hanging off her apron. Widow May with a shotgun so old it should have been in a museum. And 3 boys with pitchforks gripped too tight. No one said posse. No one said law. But the sight of neighbors standing up daylight plain made the men on the ridge understand the economy had changed. They backed their horses a step, then 2. Black Hat looked at Lila. She stood beside me with her shoulders squared and a strip of my bandana tied above her bruise like a flag. And he said, "This ain't over." And I said, "It never is." and they rode away in the dust that another man will breathe 50 miles from here. The satisfying part, if you need one, came in the quiet after. When Eli trotted back up the lane with Jasper lathered and the stage's dust still a smear across the horizon. "It's gone," he said, breathless. Driver took it, swore on his own name. And Lila let out a breath that sounded like the first note of a song. We ate peaches at the table with the door still barred just because the habit of fear stays longer than fear itself. And the room felt bigger somehow with the ledger no longer hanging above it like a storm cloud that hadn't decided where to break. I watched Lila watch the road, and I knew I'd changed lanes in my life without meaning to. Here's the part where I tell you it all wrapped up neat. That papers moved across desks and men with badges showed up at the right door, and that ledger made the world better in a straight line, but we both know the world loves circles. Maybe those names lead to other names. Maybe some get erased by people with ink. Maybe a few men face a room they can't talk out of. What I know is this. A voice asked for help and I answered. And the next morning I stood on my porch with a woman who'd taken her life back inch by inch, and a town that remembered for an hour that the way we stand is together. The camera, if there was one, would catch us in that shot. The porch in shadow, the yard silver from the night. The ridge washed clean by the first hard light, and a long road running east where dust hangs like a promise. And then it would drift higher until we're small enough to fit in a man's palm. And you can't tell if Lila is about to step off the porch toward that road or turn back inside to build something new from what's left. Either choice is true. Either choice is brave. So tell me, where do you land on this? Was I right to dig my heels in and gamble everyone's quiet for one person's freedom? Or should I have sent her on without drawing a line in the dirt? Trusting the world outside to be kinder than the one at my fence. When does a town's peace become complicity? And who gets to say what justice looks like when law and harm were the same face? Drop your take below. Right, wrong, somewhere in the hard middle. Because I've got my reasons, but community is built on our arguments as much as our agreements, and I'm listening.